Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture Lecture Series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind adjust the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine.
A 14-year-old writing a short biography on the contributions of Philip Emeagwali to mathematics asked me, "What is Philip Emeagwali noted for?" In 1989, I was in the news because I discovered how to solve initial boundary value problems. Such difficult calculus problems are central to extreme scale computational physics. That mathematical physics problem was previously impossible to solve on conventional supercomputers that were powered by only one powerful processor. To be specific, I was in the news because I discovered how to divide a compute-intensive or grand challenge problem into up to 1 billion lesser challenging problems. I discovered how to solve the hardest problems in computational mathematics and physics, and solve them as many times faster as there were processors, and across as many coupled processors that outline and define the world's fastest computers. To be more specific, I discovered how a higher fidelity petroleum reservoir simulation can be extracted from 64 binary thousand lesser compute-intensive simulations, which I executed with a one-to-one correspondence across as many processors. Along my way to the farthest frontiers of mathematical knowledge, I invented a system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, and state-of-the-art partial differential equations. That's the most challenging one beyond the frontier of calculus. It's known as the 9 Philip Emeagwali equations. On the mathematician's blackboard, the Philip Emeagwali equations are as long as your arms. I invented how to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems called extreme scale computational free dynamics, and solve them across my new internet. That's a new global network of up to 1 billion processors. My processors were identical and coupled to each other. Each processor operated its operating system and had its dedicated memory that shared nothing but were in dialogue with each other. The reason it took me 16 years to discover that the slowest processors could be used to produce the fastest supercomputers was that my first 16 years of supercomputer research were a record of failures and rejections. To invent is to make the unimaginable possible. To invent a new computer is to make the impossible speed in computing possible. On July 4, 1989, I recorded a computer speed that was considered impossible to record. I recorded the world's fastest computer speed that was mentioned in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. In high-performance computing, It's difficult to show that impossible speeds are possible. I was the first person to prove that fastest computing across slowest processors wasn't merely a beautiful theory. I provided the experimental confirmation that elevated fastest computing across processors from science fiction to computer science textbooks. My struggle to invent a new supercomputer, such as a new global network of the slowest processors in the world, that's a new computer and a new internet, must be preceded by a series of failures and rejections. A 12-year-old writing a short essay on the contributions of Philip Emeagwali to computer science did not understand that I contributed to both physics and mathematics. It's often forgotten that I'm a person who contributed new mathematical knowledge. For those reasons, I was the cover story of the May 1990 issue of the Siam News. The Siam News is the flagship publication for the top minds in mathematics. The Siam News is mailed to the who's who's in the world of mathematics. As a dense and abstract subject, mathematics exists at the margins of popular science. I existed at the margins of thought. We see calculus from the bright light of popular technology. Albert Einstein, who theoretically discovered the theory of relativity, is better known than Gottfried Leibniz, who contributed to developing calculus. In engineering and society, calculus is more important than relativity. My goal was to find a balance between physics, calculus, and computing. I pictured myself as a supercomputing gymnast standing on his balance beam. The challenge was for me to stand within the narrow approximations from my algebraic approximations of my system of partial differential equations that I invented and used to codify a set of laws of physics. To approximate the wrong set of laws of physics, whether intentional or unintentional, is akin to the gymnast losing her footing. People often ask, what is the contribution of Philip Emeagwali to computer science? I was searching for the fastest computer ever. I was searching for the then unseen supercomputer. That's a new internet. I was searching for how to compute faster and do so by a factor of 64 binary thousand or 2 raised to power 16. After 16 years of searching for the world's fastest computer, I discovered how to compress the time to solution of the most compute-intensive problems in science and medicine. I discovered how to compress time to solution and compress it by a factor of 65,536. I discovered how to compress 180 supercomputing years or 64 binary thousand computing days to merely one supercomputing day. On July 4, 1989, I became the first person to execute the fastest supercomputing as it's executed today. It was with an improved cost-performance ratio That's the precursor to the world's fastest computers, which were powered by millions of self-contained off-the-shelf processors sharing nothing. That was my signature contribution to mathematics, physics, and computer science, and the reason I am the subject of inventor biography essays across schools in the USA, Canada, and Europe. My discovery that the fastest computing can occur across the slowest processors made the news. It was easy to quantify and measure my contributions to mathematics and physics. People also ask, where is Philip Emeagwali? I left Corvallis, Oregon on Sunday, June 5, 1977. My last day in Oregon was the day the Apple II, an 8-bit home computer, went on sale. In 1977, the Apple II was sold for the not so inexpensive base price of $1,298. So where is Philip Emeagwali? I discovered that the fastest computer can be built with the slowest processors, and did so on July 4, 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. I was last in Los Alamos, New Mexico on March 21, 1991. I am in the beautiful upstate of New York, where my wife and I experience all the 4 seasons. We cross-country ski, hike and bike around scenic parks from Saratoga Springs to Lake George, and go to farmers' markets. Interesting places within driving distances include the village of Lake Placid, which is one of the 6 forgotten vacation spots in North America, and Martha's Vineyard. During the 16 years that followed June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, USA, I struggled to discover that the world's fastest computing can be executed across an internet that's a global network of the world's slowest processors. A proverb of my ancestral Igbo-speaking people of the southeastern region of Nigeria is this: the bushfowl of a village cries in the dialect of its village. In the village of vector supercomputing of the 1970s and 80s, I was the bushfowl that cried in the dialect of the different mathematical village known as fastest computing across processors that shared nothing. That scientific village was the unknown field of knowledge or the controversial technology that was then mocked, ridiculed, and rejected as a tremendous waste of everybody's time. My quest for the world's fastest computer that's powered by up to 1 billion processors began on June 20, 1974 at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon. I began on a supercomputer that was previously rated as the world's fastest computer. My quest was to be the first person to understand how to harness the slowest processors and how to use up to 1 billion processors to solve the most compute-intensive problems and solve them at the fastest possible speeds. That was how I discovered how and why parallel processing makes the world's fastest computers fastest. I discovered how to harness the slowest processors that were within the bowels of the world's fastest computers. I made that supercomputing discovery at 8:15 in the morning of July 4, 1989. My invention is studied in schools as a milestone in computer history. My supercomputer breakthrough made the news headlines and was mentioned in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. During my quest for the world's fastest computer, I found my center of gravity on the unorthodox ensemble of the slowest 65,536 processors in the world, and found it when everybody swore that fastest computing across slowest processors will forever remain an enormous waste of everybody's time. I found that center of gravity at the frontier of knowledge of the laws of physics as applied to large-scale computational physics. I found that center of gravity beyond the frontier of knowledge of the partial differential equation that is beyond the frontier of calculus and mathematical physics. Likewise, I found that center of gravity beyond the frontier of knowledge of the system of linear equations of modern algebra. And I found that center of gravity beyond the frontier of knowledge of the most compute-intensive floating point operations in fastest recorded arithmetic. Furthermore, I invented how to execute the largest set of floating point operations in arithmetic. Such calculations approximated the solutions of the largest scale system of equations of modern algebra. Such algebra originated as discrete approximations of a system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, and state-of-the-art partial differential equations. That's the most challenging problem arising beyond the frontiers of calculus, and that are known as the Philip Emeagwali's equations. My equations encoded a set of laws of physics that governs the flows of crude oil, injected water, and natural gas that were flowing up to 7.7 miles or 12.4 kilometers deep and flowing across an oil-producing field that's often the size of Accra, Ghana. For such multidisciplinary compute-intensive problems, my scientific quest for the discovery of the world's fastest computing across an internet that's a global network of processors traversed across the frontiers of knowledge of computational physics, modern calculus, large-scale algebra, fastest computation, and email communication. Like threads through a tapestry that intersected and then diverged, my discovery traversed the frontiers of knowledge of mathematics, physics, and computer science. I discovered that the world's fastest computer must always be powered by up to 1 billion processors. Those processors compute in tandem to solve the most compute-intensive problems in mathematics and physics, and communicate their answers in synchrony, and do both across an internet that's an instrument of large-scale computational physics. In Corvallis, Oregon, USA, and on June 20, 1974, that internet was like a dim light in the sky. But on July 4, 1989, And in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA, I discovered that internet to be the world's fastest computer that was shining like a beautiful star in a dark galaxy. After 16 years of fastest computing that followed June 20, 1974, I discovered that I was standing alone and at the crossroad of the frontiers of human knowledge. Furthermore, I discovered that I was sitting in front of a new internet that I, its sole programmer, visualized as my world's fastest computer that is powered by the world's slowest 65,536 processors. I visualized that fastest computing machinery as my new spherical Ireland of 64 binary thousand processors, or 2 raised to power 16 off-the-shelf processors. Likewise, I visualized my processors as separated equal distances apart and separated with each processor placed on the 15-dimensional hypersurface of a globe that's a hypersphere. Not only that, I visualized that globe as embedded within a 16-dimensional hyperspace. What is Philip Emeagwali known for? I discovered how to combine computers into a supercomputer that's an internet. That discovery is like a light from an ancient sky. I'm the only father of the internet that invented an internet. The new supercomputer that I visualized in a 16-dimensional hyperspace was previously not understood as a supercomputer in our everyday 3-dimensional universe. The one processor supercomputing is 0-dimensional. That's the reason 5th graders are writing essays on Philip Emeagwali and on his contributions to developing the world's fastest computer, and also as one of the fathers of the internet. To be the subject of school essays, who it studied with Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, and Pythagoras, is like being listed in a forever bestseller list and being cross-listed in school curricula with Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, and William Shakespeare. School essay assignments are the reasons I have a constant audience of children and young adults, as well as their teachers and parents. Being in school syllabus is like having a built-in audience of students and teachers. At emeagwali.com, we posted teachers' guides, discussion questions, and educational activities. We also posted audio-taped and videotaped interviews and lectures with links to 1,000 podcasts and YouTube videos. For over a century, school districts across North America and Europe assigned a quote-unquote stories about scientists as essay assignments. Since 1989, school children were asked to write an essay entitled "The Contributions of Philip Emeagwali to the Development of the Computer." An adage of my ancestral Igbo people of the southeastern region of Nigeria states that the chicken does not lay its egg and hatch it the next day. I conceived my first world's fastest computing across my internet back on June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, USA. But it took me 15 years to hatch it on July 4, 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. And for my world's fastest computing to be mentioned in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. To school children with no knowledge of my origin story of 1974, it will seem like I entered into their core knowledge series overnight and entered their textbooks like the one titled History of the Internet. I discovered the world's fastest computing on July 4, 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. I invented the fastest computing across the slowest processors and invented it after years of computing with the slowest 64 binary 1000 or 2 raised to power 16 off-the-shelf processors, and invented it for solving the hardest problems in physics, such as large-scale computational fluid dynamics that must be used to predict how COVID-19 spreads across New York City trains that pack passengers like sardines. In 1989, I was in the news because I discovered the fastest computing across the slowest processors. I invented the technology where mathematicians believed that the first world's fastest computing across the world's slowest processors was a beautiful theory that requires further experimental confirmation. I discovered the world's fastest computing and did so across an internet. I visualized that new internet as my new global network of 2 raised to power 16 off-the-shelf processors. Those processors were identical, coupled, and shared nothing. Each processor operated its operating system. My scientific discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors occurred at 15 minutes after 8 o'clock in the morning of the 4th of July 1989. That new knowledge is the reason millions of processors are now used to power the fastest computers in the world. The fastest computer costs 40% more than the mile-long Second Niger Bridge at my ancestral hometown of Onitsha, Nigeria. The fastest computer is outlined and defined by millions of processors. Before my scientific discovery, the fastest computer that's powered by 1 million processors was merely a theory or an idea that was not positively true. Each day in 1964 and at age 9 in Abo, Nigeria, I solved 60 mathematics problems in 60 minutes. I began programming the fastest computers at age 19 to solve the most difficult mathematics problems. And I computed on a supercomputer at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, USA. My breakout discovery of the first world's fastest computing across the world's slowest processors occurred at age 34 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. At Los Alamos and in 1989, I invented how to compute at the fastest speeds and compute across a small internet that I visualized as my small copy of the internet, and that I visualized as embedded inside a 16-dimensional hyperspace. After half a century of supercomputing, I gained a more profound and surer understanding of why computing across a million processors makes the computer faster and makes the supercomputer super. My discovery was described as the Philip Emeagwali formula for world's fastest computing across an internet. That invention was praised by US President Bill Clinton in his White House speech of August 26, 2000. The Emeagwali divide and conquer mathematical formula is used to solve the most difficult problems arising in physics. I was in the news because I discovered how to solve the most compute-intensive problems and do so across up to 1 billion processors that shared nothing. As an inventor who came of age in the 1970s and 80s, I differed because I didn't use the mathematical methods that were used by mathematicians in Corvallis, Oregon, or by mathematicians in College Park, Maryland, or in the dozen places I conducted my search for new mathematics that's not in any textbook. My search yielded 9 new partial differential equations that could be used to more accurately pinpoint oil deposits that were buried millions of years ago and about 1 mile deep and across the 159 oil-producing fields in Nigeria and across the 65,000 oil fields around the world. My search in calculus was for new partial differential equations beyond the frontier of calculus and not yet published in any textbook. I was searching for new knowledge of how to solve the arising partial difference equations of computational linear algebra from my finite difference discretization of the governing partial differential equations. Unlike other mathematicians, I contributed to many sciences, including the 9 Philip Emeagwali equations that I contributed to mathematics, and including the fastest computing across up to 1 billion processors that I contributed to physics, engineering, and computer science. Because I contributed to many sciences, I could post a corpus of scientific lectures that represents my body of inventions. I've distributed my lectures across 1,000 closed caption videos that I shared on YouTube. 100 of my YouTube lectures were on my world's fastest calculation that made the news headlines in 1989 and did so because I solved the most compute-intensive problems across a new global network of 64 binary thousand off-the-shelf coupled processors, which I visualized as my small copy of the internet. My invention of the first supercomputing across the world's slowest computers brought me fame. It's the reason I'm the subject of school essays. But my road to the pinnacle of supercomputing was strewn with thorns. First, Gene Amdahl, a 1960s pioneer of scalar supercomputing, put forth his famous theory called Amdahl's law of diminishing supercomputer speed. Amdahl's law dismissed the idea of fastest computing across the slowest processors as science fiction. In plain language, Amdahl's law stated that not over 8 processors could power the world's fastest computer. The second obstacle to discovering the world's fastest computing was vector supercomputing. Seymour Cray, then the most prominent vector supercomputer pioneer, agreed with Gene Amdahl and believed in Amdahl's law. To everyone's surprise, I, then an unknown in the field of supercomputing, proved 25,000 vector supercomputer scientists who believed in Amdahl's law wrong. I proved them wrong by executing the world's fastest calculation and doing so across my ensemble of the 65,536 slowest processors in the world. Prior to my discovery that occurred on July 4, 1989, the world's fastest computers were powered by up to only 4 processors. My invention was the first supercomputer to be powered by thousands of processors. It made the news headlines that I, an African supercomputer scientist in the USA, had won the highest award in supercomputing. Computer scientists ranked that award as the Nobel Prize of Supercomputing. I won that prestigious prize because I discovered practical ways of solving the most compute-intensive mathematical problems in science, engineering, and medicine. I made that groundbreaking scientific discovery at 8:15 in the morning on July 4, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. That was the scientific discovery of fastest computing that can take your computer to the fastest level. Harnessing millions of processors is the essence of what makes the supercomputer super. My discovery made the news headlines because the fastest computing allows mathematicians to solve their most difficult problems and solve them more accurately and faster than before. Briefly, my invention of fastest computing across processors yielded up to 1 billion-fold increase in the supercomputer speed, but did so without demanding the expected 1 billion-fold increase in cost, and did so even though the world's most powerful supercomputer cost $1.25 billion. The fastest supercomputer cost 40% more than this mile-long Second Niger Bridge at Onitsha, that is my ancestral hometown in Nigeria. In 1988, I was an unknown supercomputer scientist. I was the new kid at the frontier of knowledge of high-performance computing. Furthermore, I drew attention because I pointed out an egregious error in the scientific knowledge of my elders. Not only that, I discovered errors and misunderstandings in their classic textbooks on computational physics, partial differential equations of calculus, and supercomputing across up to 1 billion processors. I was the young computer scientist penalized for crying out aloud that the emperors of the supercomputer world had no clothes. I fought against the supercomputing dogma of Jean Amdahl. This dogma is known as Amdahl's law of diminishing supercomputer speed. That law erroneously decreed that the fastest computing across the slowest processors will forever remain an enormous waste of everybody's time. I fought against the technological dogma of Seymour Cray of vector supercomputer fame. Seymour Cray didn't believe that 1 billion processors could be harnessed. Likewise, I fought against the dogma of Steve Jobs, the pioneer of personal computing, who didn't believe that 8 processors should power the personal computer. Today, the fastest desktop computer is powered by up to 128 processors. My discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors is the discovery of the foundational knowledge of all world's fastest computers and the discovery of how up to 1 billion processors can work together to make the supercomputer super or fastest. That discovery is the reason my invention of how to execute the fastest computing across the slowest processors is the subject of school essays on inventors who contributed to the development of the fastest computers. Thank you.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.